So we are moving into shifting from a world at war with the end of World War II. But with the end of World War II will be the dawning of a new era and a new conflict. So we're going to review a little bit about how World War II comes to an end and then talk about kind of what happens when all the shooting is quote unquote finished in Europe and Japan. So, the end of World War II, you have several conferences that take place between the leaders of the Allied powers. So, in this picture here, you have Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin. They have two conferences to kind of negotiate and talk about what's going to happen now that war is seemingly going to come to an end. Before Germany surrenders in May 1945, there is a conference in Yalta. And then after the surrender of Germany, there will be another conference in Potsdam where the Allied powers will discuss how to take on Japan. So the Yalta Conference is the final meeting of what we call the Big Three. So you have Churchill of England, Franklin Roosevelt of the United States, and Stalin of the Soviet Union. They meet to discuss what Europe will look like after World War II. This is going to be the last meeting that Franklin Roosevelt will have with these leaders as he dies in April. So at Yalta, there are six major topics discussed. They want unconditional surrender of the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Again, unconditional means we want these totally surrender. We're not giving them anything. We're not giving up anything. Like, we want this war to be over. They also talk about how ineffective the League of Nations was that was created after World War I. So we need a new type of international organization, and they're going to form the United Nations, where the big major countries will be able to hold power. So the United States, England, Russia, France, and China should form the League of Nations, allowing other smaller nations to also join. Another topic that's discussed is that as soon as the war in Europe was over, that Russia would join the war against Japan with the United States, and they would help the United States invade Japan. And the last thing they talk about is that they're going to divide Austria, Germany, and the capital of Germany, Berlin, into four occupied zones, which means that these zones would be controlled by the winning powers, the United States, England, France, and the Soviet Union. You'll notice here that the Soviet Union is also referred to as the USSR, that stands for the United Soviet Socialist Republic. So, what the occupation is going to look like, you're going to have the former border of Germany is the big nation that you see here. And you can see that we're going to divide it into a British zone, a Soviet zone, a United States zone, and a French zone. But then zone in here on Berlin. If you look at the map over here, we're going to separate Berlin, which is in the Soviet zone, in also into four zones. That's going to be important when we get to one of the first major crises between the Soviet Union and the United States. Okay, so you can see basically this just circled what I circled. All right, so the Yalta Conference, the final things that are discussed. Roosevelt and Churchill at this point become concerned that Stalin is going to try to make all of the Eastern European countries that he invaded to be communist after war. They being Roosevelt and Churchill, wanted self-determination, which meant that the countries themselves would have the option to be democratic like us, where they had popular vote, or if they did want to be communists. So those countries would be Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Stalin agrees at Yalta to have self-determination as long as he can have part of Poland. Poland should have free elections, according to the Big Three. So, as I said, Roosevelt dies in April. So now we're going to have a second conference that takes place after the surrender of Germany in the summer of 1945. That will be at Potsdam, Stalin, Truman, and Churchill. So at the Potsdam conference, Germany has surrendered. So now Stalin begins to pressure those same Eastern European countries to become communists. Truman, who's taken over now after Franklin Roosevelt, is unhappy with these new pro-Soviet governments. He demands that Stalin allows free elections. Stalin refuses. He feared that these nations would become anti-Soviet and they would be a threat to his own country. So as you see here in the map, all the countries that are in green, Stalin forces to become communists. You have the nations that are in orange that will become allies with the United States. They will join what ends up becoming known as NATO. And then we have the purple countries that remain neutral. So what this does is this ultimately leads to the beginning of the Cold War. When the war ends, really the United States and the Soviet Union are the two remaining superpowers of the world. All of the European countries are totally destroyed as a result of the war. So you have the United States that is capitalist and democratic, the USSR, which is communist. These extremely different beliefs, different points of view, both economically and politically, are going to lead to what becomes known as a long period called the Cold War. They're going to fight for control of European countries, but also supremacy throughout the world. So we'll step aside from that for a moment and try to figure out what happened with Japan. Japan had to surrender unconditionally. MacArthur, who's the general in the Pacific, takes over the rebuilding process of Japan. And the United States would write their constitution. The constitution under Japan stated that Japan could not rebuild its Navy, Air Force, or Army. Emperor Hirohito has his power taken away. He's kind of left in power, but it's more of just as a figurehead. The power will come from Parliament itself. Back in Europe, you have the ending and results of the Holocaust, where 6 million Jewish people, as well as other Europeans, are killed. They return home and they realize that their homes basically had been either burned, destroyed, or been taken over. A lot of citizens, even though people knew and saw that the Holocaust had taken place, were still very anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic. The citizens believed that Jewish people would come back and try to take over again. They also thought that there would be, Jewish people trying to carry out different rituals against them. So many survivors of the Holocaust have to kind of find a place to go. They move west, they live in displacement camps, but for some of them, they choose to immigrate to other countries. The United States is one of those nations. But Jewish people also had been removed from what they consider to be their traditional homeland of Israel and Jerusalem, which at the time was known as Palestine. So the Jewish people want to move back to Palestine, which will become known as Israel. Britain is in control of Palestine and restricted Jews from moving there. Palestine at the time is an Arab nation. So the British and the United Nations decide to create the nation of Israel as a post-Holocaust place for Jewish people to go. With the British mandate over Palestine ending in 1948, the United Nations basically turns Palestine into Israel and divides it into two sections. There would be a Jewish section and an Arab section. Both Jewish people and Arabs believe that Israel is the Holy Land to them and was given to them by God. And Jerusalem is the holy city for both of those religions. Also for the Catholic religion and Christian religion too, that place is a very important place. So what the creation of Israel does is it causes many problems between both of these groups. Those problems still exist today. You have a terrorist group that carried out a massive attack against Israelis in October. And since then, Israel has been bombing parts of Palestine, and notably Gaza. That is still a conflict that is happening on a regular basis. And actually, in the last week or so, you've had Pro-Israeli protests, pro-Palestinian protests erupt across colleges in the United States as well. In the United States, it's kind of in the middle of these two places. So if you're wondering where is Israel, Israel is located in the Middle East. It is this red country that you see here, located near Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. And as you can see here, in 1947, they divide the country into sections between the Jewish state and the Arab state. Over time, the Jewish state has kind of whittled away at what is left of the Arab state and controls a pretty significant portion of what is Israel today. So, kind of transitioning and going back to the conversation about the Cold War, again, United States and the Soviet Union are the two winners, and they have several post-war goals. The United States wants to encourage democracy across the world, also help Europe to regrow its markets, rebuild Europe, and reunite Germany. The Soviets want to control Eastern Europe, encourage the spread of communism, and rebuild the Soviet Union. They want to keep Germany divided. So these major problems are going to lead to what becomes known as the Cold War. And in the next video, we'll talk about the political moments of the Cold War that take place over several decades, several proxy wars where both countries will get involved in fighting in other parts of the world that aren't directly against themselves.